Some criticisms of Marxism, Part 2. The idea of historical progress is largely a myth. Marxism does not limit itself to just economic analysis or prediction. Several key tenets of Marxism have to deal with history and the supposed progress of history. In the context of progress, Marxism's analysis of history is directly connected to its economic analysis. Just like Marxism's economic analysis, its historical analysis is deeply flawed. Marxism relies upon dialectical materialism for both its economic and historical analyses. Dialectics is a philosophical concept largely derived from Hegel that seeks, quote, to describe a method of philosophical argument that involves some sort of contradictory process between opposing sides, unquote. It is a form of philosophical inquiry that seeks to find the truth through the counterposition of opposing schemas. In many ways, it is similar to Platonic dialogues or the Socratic method. Hegel primarily applied this approach in the analysis and the change of ideas. Beginning with an initial premise, the thesis, it is highly unlikely that this initial premise is perfectly conceived. Very likely there are contradictions within the thesis. These inherent contradictions within the thesis will invariably birth its opposite, the antithesis. Being opposites of one another, thesis and antithesis combat one another. Neither can exist simultaneously. They must be in conflict. This conflict will leave neither of the ideas unscathed. In the process of their battle, the two ideas invariably combine into a synthesis. The weaknesses of both are shed away, the strengths retained in the creation of a stronger premise. However, this new synthesis is itself not a perfect conception. The synthesis itself gives birth to a new antithesis. Thus, the cycle continues once more and arguably will continue forever. This is the essence of Hegelian dialectics. This framework became, and remains, a very influential philosophic process of argumentation. In particular, Hegel had a great influence on the thinking and the writings of Karl Marx, as well as his followers. The Marxist definition of dialectics is very similar to the Hegelian definition. Quote, dialectics is the method of reasoning which aims to understand things concretely in all of their movement, change, and interconnection with their opposite and contradictory sides in unity, unquote. There are two main innovations that Marx contributed to the use of dialectics: a focus on materialism and an application of dialectics to history. Hegel's philosophy was very focused upon ideas and spirit, for which Marx roundly criticized him. Marxism sought to focus on materialism. Marxist philosophy sought to, quote, emphasize the material world, the world outside of consciousness, as the foundation and determinant of thinking, especially in relation to the question of the origin of knowledge. Compare with idealism. For materialism, thoughts are reflections of matter outside of mind, which existed before and independently of thought, unquote. This emphasis upon material reality as opposed to idealism or spirit was a strong influence on Marxism's atheism. It contributes greatly to Marx's famous phrase, religion is the opiate of the masses. With this materialist focus in hand, Marxism sought to use dialectics to analyze history, supposedly scientifically. This is what is often described as historical materialism. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, historical materialism is, quote, centered around the idea that forms of society rise and fall as they further and then impede the development of human productive power. Marx sees the historical processes as proceeding through a necessary series of modes of production characterized by class struggle, culminating in communism, unquote. Lenin defined historical materialism as, quote, materialism as applied to the social life of mankind has to explain social consciousness as the outcome of social being, unquote. Joseph Stalin also offered his own definition. Quote, historical materialism is the extension of the principles of dialectical materialism to the study of social life, an application of the principles of dialectical materialism to the phenomena of the life of society, to the study of society and of its history, unquote. The idea of class struggle is arguably the basis of all Marxist analysis and is the root of his dialectical analysis of history and economics. The rich and the poor of every age are always in conflict with one another. This conflict invariably leads to the development of the next economic age. This historical and dialectical development of human history recurs frequently as a theme in Marx's writings. It rears its head in the Communist Manifesto, wherein Marx writes that, quote, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, unquote. Later, Marx goes on to expand upon this idea of class conflict, tracing it through the millennia. Marx writes, quote, freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on in an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes, unquote. These themes of class conflict and the resulting dialectical struggle can be found throughout Marx's writings, not just in the Communist Manifesto. Das Kapital, the German ideology, among other writings, feature this common theme. These examples will be discussed momentarily. What is important to observe here is that Marx is asserting that economic development and class conflict, this historical dialectic, is the primary, if not the sole, driving force of history. Marx is not alone in asserting this. His followers also asserted similar statements. Lenin writes, quote, Marx studies as a process of natural history the birth of the new society from the old, unquote. While it would be unfair to say that Marxists only view history and society through the economic lens, Marx and Engels certainly use the economic lens more often than not. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, quote, the driving force of history in Cohen's reconstruction of Marx is the development of the productive forces, the most important of which is technology, unquote. Engels himself acknowledges this in a private letter in 1890. He writes, quote, Marx and I ourselves are partly to blame for the fact that the younger people sometimes lay more stress on the economic side than is due to it, unquote. For Marx, the economic factors of production determined nearly every aspect of society. Marx writes, quote, assume a particular state of development in the productive faculties of man, and you will get a particular form of commerce and consumption. Assume particular stages of development in production, commerce, and consumption, and you will have a corresponding social constitution, a corresponding organization of the family, of orders or of classes. In a word, a corresponding civil society. Assume a particular civil society, and you will get particular political conditions which are only the official expression of civil society, unquote. Given these factors, it seems fair to say that Marxism is very much focused upon an economic analysis of history and society. While these modes of historical analysis are helpful, it is certainly possible to make a historical argument centered around the conflict of classes or the changes in the modes of economic production. Marx and his followers give these forms of analysis undue importance. For one thing, Marxism in these analyses asserts that there is such a thing as historical progress. All of history must develop along particular and necessary lines towards a particular and inevitable goal. The kind of class conflicts that were described earlier are, according to the Marxists, not only natural, but inevitable and necessary. Each stage of economic progress is the result of previous class struggles and are necessary towards grasping the end goal. Marx writes in Das Kapital, quote, It consequently creates a definite organization of the labor of society, and thereby develops at the same time new productive forces in the society. In its specific capitalist form and under the given conditions, it could take no other form than a capitalistic one," unquote. In this regard, Marx is asserting that the present form of production, the capitalist form, is not only inevitable, but a necessary step towards communism. Later, in the same work, Marx reasserts that the historical necessity of capitalism as a stepping stone. Quote, "The capitalist mode of production presents itself to us historically as a necessary condition to the transformation of the labor process into a social process," unquote. In a separate work, Marx summarizes this historical development in a rather succinct way. Marx lays out 3 bullet points in the essay Class Struggle and Mode of Production. Quote, 1. The existence of classes is only bound up with particular historical phases in the development of production. 2. That the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. 3. That this dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society, unquote. Marx's followers also make frequent reference to this idea of historical progress. Lenin's work, State and Revolution, is replete with such assertions. Stalin likewise echoes such ideas. Stalin writes, quote, "There are different kinds of social ideas and theories. There are old ideas and theories which have outlived their day and which serve the interests of the moribund forces of society. Their significance lies in the fact that they hamper the development of the progress of society. Then there are new and advanced ideas and theories which serve the interests of the advanced forces of society. Their significance lies in the fact that they facilitate the development, the progress of society, and their significance is the greater the more accurately they reflect the needs of development of the material life of society," unquote. The Marxists are often enamored of the idea of historical progress, so much so that it is one of the key underpinnings of the entire ideology. The trouble with this kind of thinking is that, for one, it often assumes a conclusion and then seeks to fix data in order to fit that conclusion. It results in a cherry-picking of facts to fit the thesis. In this instance, Marx assumes that the classless communist society is not only the end point of all history, but is also inevitable. Connected to this, because progress implies an end goal towards which one is advancing, progress for one person could very well be regression for another. It is a concept that is heavily dependent upon the subjective stance of the observer. Furthermore, Marx assumes that history will come to an end with the rise of the proletarian revolution. Class conflict coming to an end will invariably lead to the end of historical change and progress. No more progress is possible since the end goal has been achieved. Any student of history will see that this is a massive assumption. Francis Fukuyama made a similar prediction at the end of the Cold War, titling his book The End of History and the Last Man. Fukuyama essentially declared in 1992 that the liberal capitalist order would be ascendant. Many described the 1990s as a holiday from history. Most people did not foresee the rise of Islamist terror groups in Afghanistan or Iraq, let alone the September 11th attacks. This gives the lie to the idea of an end point of history. So long as there are human beings, history will continue its own course, a river that is nearly impossible to predict. This idea of there being an end point in history is likewise an extremely millenarian conception. Despite Marx's protestations, his vision of communism is a utopian vision. It is a borderline religious ideal that spurs zealous fervor. Engels embodied this religious fervor when he wrote, quote, "This is our calling, that we shall become the Templars of this grail. Gird the sword round our loins for its sake, and stake our lives joyfully in the last holy war, which will be followed by the 1,000-year reign of freedom. And such is the power of the idea that he who has recognized it cannot cease to speak of its splendor or to proclaim its all-conquering might. He who has one beheld it can never abandon it. He must follow it where it leads, even to death. And this belief in all-conquering might of the idea, the victory of eternal truth, this firm confidence that it can never waver or yield, even if the whole world were to rise against it, that is the true religion, the basis of the true positive philosophy, the philosophy of world history." Unquote. It is for this reason the historian A. James Gregor referred to Marxism as one of several political religions. Gregor's chapter on Marxism is titled "History as Religion." Along with this, much of history itself belies the assertion of progress. The past is replete with the rise and fall of civilizations. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476, it ushered in what is often referred to as the Dark Ages. While this term is largely a misnomer, the name underlines an inherent truth. On average, life was better at the height of the Roman Empire than it was in the 1200s. It took centuries for Western European cities to regain the population they had under the Romans. For centuries, the aqueducts towered over peasants who could never have dreamed of replicating them. Other forms of Roman engineering, like roads, continued to be used, the inhabitants of Europe unable to do better for nearly a millennium. The idea of people living worse than their ancestors did is certainly a strange concept to a reader in the 21st century. But the truth is that it is always a possibility. This truth, furthermore, undermines the central Marxist contention that there is progress in history, steady and unhalting. Connected to this, there are examples of civilizations deliberately choosing stagnation over progress. A famous example of this is under the Ming Dynasty in China in the 15th century. The Ming fleets were second to none throughout this period, massive junks that dwarfed Columbus's ships. Under the command of Admiral Zheng He, these treasure ships sailed from China all the way to the coasts of Africa, collecting tribute and trade goods all along the way. It was a form of demonstrating China's strength, economically, militarily, technologically. However, despite this progress, Ming officials decided to scrap the entire fleet by 1525. There were several reasons for this decision. Chief among them was that the Ming rulers believed it was a bad investment. They were already emperors of the world. What was the purpose of this expensive military institution? Unfortunately for the Chinese, this decision would have long-term consequences as Europeans began entering the Indian Ocean trade network. This example further undermines the Marxist contention of unwavering and inevitable progress. Connected to this, it is apparent that Marxist analysis of history and economics was extremely Eurocentric. But this will be discussed at length in the next video. Besides this idea of progress, Marxism also asserts that such dialectical changes can be measured and predicted scientifically. Hence, Marxism's pretension to describe itself as scientific socialism. Trotskyist political scientist Alan Woods writes, quote, "Marxists do not see history as a mere series of isolated facts, but rather they seek to discover the general processes and laws that govern nature and society. The first condition for science in general is that we are able to look beyond the particular and arrive at the general. The idea that human history is not governed by any laws is contrary to all science." Unquote. This contention that human behavior can be measured or studied scientifically is a rather troubling proposition for several reasons. On one hand, human beings are notoriously difficult to study scientifically, particularly since the subjects under study have agency. Having free will means that the subjects of study will not behave uniformly. Human beings do not behave like molecules or atoms. Furthermore, such a conception assumes that human beings not only can be studied, but are fully capable of studying. Ray Dingledine writes about the myriad ways in which science is often undermined by human observers. Among many reasons, Dingledine notes particularly, quote, our drive to create a coherent narrative from new data, regardless of its quality or relevance, and our inclination to seek patterns in data, whether they exist or not, unquote. These are particularly troublesome aspects of human observation that ultimately undermine the scientific process. If such problems can arise when studying medicine or atoms, what then can be said when one is studying political economy? Further, such a conception can be seen as deeply flawed when it does not transpose onto real-world behavior. When Marx's inevitable and scientific theory of history does not follow through, it can be observed to be deeply flawed. This, in particular, can be seen when one looks at where Marx predicted the communist revolutions would take place and compare that to where such revolutions actually took place. As one Indian scholar wrote, quote, naturally, in the thinking of Marx and Engels, following the materialist conceptions of history, there could be no question of a proletarian revolution in the quasi-absence of a proletariat, unless Marx's Russian experience had made him abandon his materialism for which there is no textual evidence, unquote. Such failures in Marx's predictions will be discussed at length in another video of this series. Let it be observed here, however, that such failed predictions fundamentally undermine the Marxist pretension to scientific inevitability. The idea of progress is a key tenet of Marxism and its offshoots. The communists worldwide asserted that they were working towards historical and social progress. As was demonstrated throughout this video, the conception of progress is specious at best. Furthermore, it is largely bolstered by ahistorical assertions, and it primarily draws its data from European examples. As will be seen in the next video, Marxist analysis is incredibly Eurocentric and largely ignores wide swaths of the human experience.